July 18th, 1996. The humid July air clung to New York City like a second skin, but inside the Ramada Plaza Hotel, known among bereaved families as Heartbreak Hotel, the temperature had dropped to a chill that permeated every exhausted heart. Built of unremarkable white brick and offering 478 rooms just off the Van Wyck Expressway, the Ramada had become ground zero for grief. A makeshift counseling center, a media staging ground, and a vigil site for those who refused to believe their loved ones were gone. Joe Lychner checked in under his own name, though it felt to him like wearing a target. He carried only a duffel bag and a single white rose, one for his wife, Pam, and two more tucked safely in an inner pocket for their daughters, 10-year-old Shannon and 8-year-old Katie. The previous evening, TWA Flight 800 had exploded just 12 minutes after taking off from JFK, bound for Paris. All 230 souls on board perished in a raging fireball over the Atlantic. Among them, the three people Joe loved most. In the lobby, flat-screen televisions piped non-stop news coverage. Grainy footage showed debris fields and salvage crews, but offered no reassurance. Joe placed his rose on a low table next to stacks of grief pamphlets and sank into a stiff sofa. He dialed home for the 100th time. Each ring deepened the pit in his stomach until it felt as though someone had kicked him there, again and again. "If my wife didn't make the flight," he'd protested to TWA, "she would have called me," but no one could produce that call. He drifted through the hallways in a daze, passing other families clutching photographs and open notebooks filled with urgent prayers. "Please God, let tomorrow bring good news." None came. Room 314 became his world. There, he unpacked a single photograph of his smiling family, snapped only days before in the Houston suburb where they lived. He spoke to it as though Pam could hear him. "She's not gone. I feel it." Breakfast in the dining room was silent. Chairs scraped and murmured in low tones as newcomers arrived, eyes glazed, mouths tight. Staff moved swiftly to refill coffee pots and reset tables stamped with the hotel's logo, a bitter irony for those who could barely swallow. Joe forced down toast, fearing any more sustenance might cement the truth he refused to accept. Each day began the same. Wake, dial, wait, drift, watch, repeat. He visited the staging area by the airport perimeter, where debris lay in plastic bins and forensic teams combed for remains. He watched from a distance as divers dragged the ocean floor, imagining Pam's perfume drifting in the current, Katie's stuffed rabbit bobbing like driftwood. He dropped his red rose into the grey water, watching it float before the tide carried it away. At odds with the relentless passage of time, Joe found himself outside the hotel doors at dawn, waiting for any scrap of information, hope flaring like a match struck in darkness. He recalled Pam's laughter when she'd taught their daughters to ride bikes, Katie's shy smile when she first lost a tooth, Shannon's proud grin as she held up her Monet-inspired painting. He clung to these memories, refusing the void. The hotel staff, accustomed now to tragedies piling up under their roof, offered whispered condolences. Counselors handed out tissues and encouraged survivors to share stories, an exercise in both catharsis and agony. Joe's voice shook as he recounted, night after night, the last embrace he'd shared with Pam at Houston's airport. "She wrapped her arms and legs around me twice," he told the group, "because she didn't want me to go." No one could imagine the weight of that farewell. Outside, families of other victims began to drift away, convinced the bodies would never be found. Their departure left corridors emptier, the mourning quieter. Yet Joe could not leave. He believed that if he stayed, if he kept hope alive at every window overlooking the runway, somehow Pam and the girls would walk back through the doors. "She's not gone, I feel it." The third week found him haggard but unbowed. His eyes, red-rimmed from sleepless nights, scanned every arriving flight at JFK, every uniform face in the terminal. Friends called from Houston. "Time will help you move on," they said. But Joe knew that moving on felt like betrayal. His world had stopped on July the 17th. Until the final truth reached him, he would keep waiting. Joe's mornings bled into afternoons, and afternoons bled into nights without distinction. By the fourth week, his existence revolved entirely around the airport perimeter fence, where he paced in a restless loop, his eyes fixed on the departing terminals. He learned every detail of the facility, the sharp clink of the tarmac gates, the tired shuffle of baggage handlers, the metallic echo of fuel trucks backing into place. Each sound carried the faintest hope. Perhaps this time, Pam would step off the jet bridge with Shannon and Katie in tow. Inside the hotel room, the air was stale with unanswered prayers. The single suitcase remained unpacked, as though Joe's refusal to settle might somehow tether him to reality more firmly. He slept in his clothes, head pressed against the photograph of his family pinned to the wall. He woke in a panic when the house phone rang. Every ring stabbed his heart, only to deliver another consoling voicemail from the Red Cross or TWA, each message framing condolences with robotic formalities that grated against his soul. Outside, the heat of late July gave way to the creeping damp of August mornings. Dew coated the grass beside the chain-link fence in silver droplets, glistening under the airport floodlights. Joe knelt to collect one with the tip of his finger, envisioning it as a divine sign, proof that life, however small, endured. He tucked that droplet into his pocket, alongside 2 white feathers he'd found on the runway side, believing them to be tokens sent from his daughters. At dusk, as the sky turned the color of bruised plums, he encountered Sarah Chang, the petite Korean-American woman who'd lost her teenage son, Michael, in the blast. She recognized him from the hotel lobby and offered a tired smile. Sarah carried a small notebook she'd turned into a scrapbook, clippings of news articles, typed transcripts of pilot communications, even drawings Michael had made for her just before the flight. Together, they stood shoulder to shoulder by the fence, sharing whispered recollections and speculations. "He always slipped me a note when I hugged him at the gate," Sarah said softly, flipping through a page. "He wrote, 'See you soon, Mom.' How could he know?" Joe reached out and touched Michael's last drawing, a simple sketch of Sarah's favorite hibiscus flower. The fragility of the pencil lines made him ache for his own daughter's laughter. By the 5th week, volunteers set up a small memorial garden near where Joe stood. White roses, daisies, and lilies grew in pots, each marked with a tiny flag bearing a name: Pam Lychner, Shannon Lychner, Katie Lychner. Joe planted his remaining rose at the center, its petals open to the sky. He knelt on the damp earth, whispering an apology for all the love he couldn't protect. One humid afternoon, a young investigator from the National Transportation Safety Board approached him. She carried a tablet loaded with photographs of recovered seat cushions, life vests, and fragments of luggage. She spoke gently, explaining the painstaking process of identification: DNA samples, dental records, personal effects. Joe felt a wave of vertigo. He gripped the investigator's arm, his voice a cracked whisper. "Can you tell me anything? Anything at all?" She shook her head, regret softening her gaze. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Lychner. We're doing everything we can." That night, Joe returned to his room and sat on the edge of the bed. He opened Sarah's scrapbook and added a pressed rose petal between the pages. He lit a single candle and allowed its flickering light to dance across the walls, painting shadows of hope and despair. For a moment, he closed his eyes and imagined Pam calling his name, her voice warm and clear. He reached out his arms, yearning to be held again. Meanwhile, the news cycle moved on. Coverage of the disaster dwindled as new tragedies grabbed headlines. Familiar faces from the live broadcasts grew more distant. Reporters no longer hovered at the hotel lobby. Microphones and cameras vanished. Joe noticed the silence keenly, like the hush that follows a thunderclap. With fewer sympathetic eyes, he hugged his vigil even tighter, convinced that absence of acknowledgement didn't equate to absence of truth. As August waned, the first batch of remains was identified. Families gathered at the airport chapel for a small service. Prayers, hymns, tears. Joe lingered outside the wooden doors, afraid that crossing the threshold would make everything irrevocable. He listened to the faint hum of the organ and the soft murmur of names being read. Somewhere inside, he knew a piece of him would finally accept the finality, yet he stayed at the door, whispering to the empty air, "You're not gone. I feel you. I'll wait." His vigil had become a testament not only to loss, but to unwavering faith in love's persistence. The sun dipped low on what would be his 42nd day of waiting. Joe looked down at the long row of white candles flickering in the memorial garden, casting a warm glow over wilted petals and sun-scorched grass. He lingered there, rooted in hope and heartache, as the airport lights blinked on in the gathering dusk. Morning light seeped through the thin curtains of room 314, illuminating motes of dust that danced like tiny ghosts. Joe awoke to the distant hum of luggage carts and the soft murmur of travelers in the hallway. He sat up and stared at the photograph of his family taped above the nightstand. Pam's gentle smile, Shannon's proud grin holding her Monet painting, Katie's shy tilt of the head. Their faces felt achingly vivid in the dawn's glow, as if they might step from the frame at any moment. He dressed in the same clothes he'd worn for days, the denim shirt slightly stiff around the collar, the creases of the jeans worn but neat. He tucked the photograph into his breast pocket, close to his heart, and headed down to the lobby. The staff greeted him with quiet nods. They no longer offered coffee or tissues, as though they had learned that nothing could ease his vigil. Outside, the August air was heavy, charged with the promise of a storm. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind picked up, rustling the memorial garden, where dozens of white candles still burned in flickering lines. Joe paused at the edge of the planted beds, his boots sinking into damp soil. He knelt and brushed a strand of grass away from a single white rose whose petals trembled in the breeze. He whispered a silent apology as he straightened, tucking his hands into his pockets. Ahead, the small wooden doors of the airport chapel stood closed, varnished oak etched with simple crosses. A brass plaque read, "For all who seek solace." Joe's heart pounded as he approached. He thought of the families gathered inside the day before, singing hymns, weeping in shared sorrow. Part of him wanted to join them, to let the hymns wash over him, even if acceptance lurked in their shadows. Yet another part feared that crossing the threshold would burn away the last tendrils of hope. He glanced down the hallway at Sarah Chang, standing a few paces behind him, her scrapbook clutched to her chest like a lifeline. She caught his eye and offered a small, understanding smile. Together, they moved toward the entrance. Joe hesitated, then reached out and pushed the door open. Inside, the chapel was cool and dim. Rows of wooden pews faced a simple altar draped in white linen. A single beam of sunlight streamed through a stained glass window, painting the floor in shards of ruby and sapphire. Holy scripts lined the walls. "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." The verses felt both comforting and cruel. Families filled the pews. Some bowed in prayer, others sat in stunned silence. Faces Joe recognized from the Ramada drifted in groups, their sorrow at varying stages of rawness and resignation. He found an empty pew near the back and sat, the polished wood cool against his palms. He closed his eyes, head bent, trying to steady his breathing. A minister began a gentle invocation, his voice reverberating off the vaulted ceiling. The congregation rose to sing a hymn, "Amazing Grace." Joe's throat tightened as the melody took shape. Each verse carried the weight of loss, but also the promise of grace and renewal. Sarah sat beside him, her hand finding his for a brief moment of shared solidarity. When the singing ended, the minister invited anyone who wished to share memories to come forward. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Michael's father stepped up, voice wavering as he spoke of his son's love for soccer and his dream to play professionally. Tears streamed down cheeks all around, and Joe felt the dam inside him crack. He stood, photograph in hand, and made his way to the front. His legs shook as he addressed the small gathering. "My wife, Pam, taught second grade," he began, voice rough. "She had a laugh that could light up a room. Our daughters—" He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Katie loved her stuffed rabbit, and Shannon painted flowers in every color she could find." He pulled a pressed rose petal from his pocket and held it aloft. "This petal is from my daughter's favorite bouquet. And this rose—" He showed the photo in his hand. "This was from our last trip together, a family vacation to Galveston. I kept the photo here because I need to know they existed." The chapel was silent, except for muffled sobs. Joe felt something shift within him, a recognition that, while death had taken their bodies, no one could ever take away their existence or the love they'd shared. He closed his eyes, tears tracing hot trails down his cheeks, and sank to his knees before the altar. The congregation bowed their heads as he prayed aloud for peace, for strength to move forward without forgetting. He prayed for Sarah's son, for the other 228 victims, and for every family still tethered to hope and grief. When he finally rose, the ache in his chest was still there, but something else took root, an ember of acceptance that flickered with newfound warmth. After the service, the chapel doors opened to a gray sky spitting rain. Sarah and Joe walked back to the fence, sharing an umbrella patched with hopeful prayer symbols. No longer did they stand as isolated souls. They were part of a fragile community bound by loss and remembrance. As they reached the memorial garden, water dappled the candles, causing the flames to dance and bend. Joe knelt beside the rose he had planted weeks ago. He brushed away raindrops from the petals, marveling at their resilience. He realized that while the storm might bend them, it would not break them, and neither would his spirit. He placed his hand on the wet earth and whispered, "I'll carry you with me always." That evening, back in his room, Joe updated the scrapbook he had begun, gluing in a pressed prayer card from the chapel service and penning a note at the edge, "In sorrow, we find each other." He closed the book with determination. The vigil at the fence would continue, but now it would be balanced by the steps he took forward, small, unsteady, but measured. As he lay in bed, the thunderstorm rolling overhead, Joe allowed himself to drift towards sleep without clinging to the photograph. Instead, he envisioned Pam's laughter echoing in his mind, Shannon's bright paintings lining the walls of their Houston home, Katie's soft, "I love you, Daddy," as she drifted off at night. In the quiet darkness, he felt them with him, gone in body but present in love. Dawn broke over JFK with a pale, reluctant glow, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise on another day of grief. Joe stepped out of room 314 into the quiet corridor, every footstep echoing like a heartbeat. He paused by the service cart, now stripped of tissues and coffee cups, an abandoned sarcophagus of small comforts. He swiped his keycard and descended to the lobby, passing receptionists whose faces had blurred into a sameness, each one as distant as the departing flights he watched. Outside, the cool morning air bit at his lungs. He wrapped his arms around himself and turned toward the fence, the iron chain links etched with names and prayers carved into plastic hearts. "Pam," he whispered, tracing her name with the tip of his finger. Behind him, the terminal's roar began anew. Engines, announcements, rolling suitcases, life's insistence on moving forward. He settled onto a weathered bench and pulled from his pocket the small spiral notebook Sarah had given him, a gift born of shared sorrow. Inside, she had written, "When the world moves on, our memories remain. Write them down." Joe opened to a blank page and stared at the blankness as though it might threaten to swallow him whole. He cleared his throat, dipped his pen in trembling fingers, and wrote, "First memory, Pam dancing barefoot in the kitchen to Creedence Clearwater Revival, spoon in hand, as Katie tried to catch the notes with her tiny voice." The words spilled out faster than he could control. Stories of bedtime songs, of summer road trips across Texas, of Shannon's first day of school when Pam held her hand tighter than necessary because she was both mother and protector. Each line carved a corridor through the darkness, leading him back to light. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Rosa Alvarez, a South American grandmother whose granddaughter had been a flight attendant on that tragic night. Rosa wore a faded shawl and carried a battered leather satchel. She sat beside Joe and studied his writing. "Memories are seeds," she said, in Spanish-accented English. "Plant enough of them, and something beautiful will grow." Joe nodded, letting her words settle like rain upon parched earth. Together, they watched a Lufthansa flight taxi to Gate 4. The engines thundered, the jet bridge hissed into place, and new travelers spilled into the terminal. Families with rolling strollers, businessmen in tailored suits, tourists in straw hats. Joe traced their faces, imagining which ones would make it home tonight, and which ones might never return. He shivered, not from cold, but from the ache of knowing how fragile each journey could be. Later that afternoon, he joined a small gathering at the airport's community room, a space hastily arranged for survivors and family members. Bright fluorescent lights hummed overhead as volunteers served lukewarm soup. Joe found a seat at a round table where the walls were lined with bulletin boards, covered in photographs, postcards, tiny messages pinned with colored thumbtacks. Someone had arranged a tribute wall, a mosaic of smiles and stories, each one a testament to life lived and love shared. He approached the wall and slid his hand beneath a photograph of Pam, Shannon, and Katie at Galveston Beach. He pressed a small note next to it. "Never forgotten, always loved." Beside his note, someone else had written, "Your tears water the seeds of hope." Joe stepped back and allowed himself a moment to absorb the collective warmth that radiated from those pinned memories. That evening, he returned to the hotel room, carrying the notebook filled with his memories. He placed it on the nightstand alongside the photograph of his family and the single white rose, now pressed flat between two sheets of wax paper. He lit a desk lamp, its soft glow illuminating the pages, and reread what he had written. The words felt like reaching hands, proof that his family's spirit lived on in the world of the living. Exhaustion tugged at him, but sleep remained elusive. Instead, he slipped on his jacket and stepped outside into the cooling air. Above him, the sky spread wide and unhindered, a canvas of deepening blues. He lifted his face to the stars, seeking constellations he and Pam once named together. Somewhere among those distant sparks was a memory of her voice, soft, reassuring, telling him that even in darkness, light found a way. At the fence, he knelt and pressed a palm flat against the cold metal. He spoke aloud, as though Pam could hear him on the other side. "I'm writing our story, one memory at a time. I'm planting seeds for a future that honors you." His voice cracked, but he continued, each word a brick laid in the foundation of his new life. When he finally returned to the room, the storm past had left a hush over the airport grounds. The candles in the memorial garden flickered out one by one as the night deepened. Joe slipped under the covers and closed his eyes, the gentle rise and fall of his breath a fragile acknowledgement that he too would survive. In the quiet, he whispered one final promise. "I'll keep waiting, but I'll also keep living. For you." Weeks had passed since Joe's vigil transformed into quiet determination, and the seasons seemed to shift around him while he remained anchored to his promise. September's crisp mornings carried the tang of autumn leaves drifting across the tarmac. Early flights now carried sweaters and scarves instead of summer bikinis, and the distant rumble of jet engines felt less like thunder and more like a lullaby inviting him forward. One morning, as mist curled over the runway, Joe discovered a new bloom in the memorial garden, a single purple iris, its petals unfurling defiantly in the damp soil. No flag marked the spot, and he wondered who had planted it, or if it had sprung up by some miracle of nature. He knelt and traced the delicate lines of its petals, imagining Pam's delight at such a vivid flower. He pressed a thumb to one soft petal, feeling its fragile strength, and tucked the memory into his heart. Later that day, Joe attended a support group meeting held in the airport community center. The room, warmed by fluorescent lights and the soft hum of conversation, hosted a circle of chairs occupied by those who, like him, sought solace in shared wounds. On this particular afternoon, the group welcomed a guest speaker, Dr. Ellen Marcus, a psychologist specializing in trauma and resilience. She spoke of grief as a river, winding its way through rocky terrain, sometimes swift and roaring, sometimes wide and languid, but always moving toward an unseen sea. Joe listened as she described how survivors could learn to navigate its currents rather than be swept away. When she finished, she invited participants to describe what gave them the strength to carry on. One by one, voices trembled in confession. A son's baseball glove preserved in cedar, a mother's lullaby humming on an old tape recorder, a father's promise to complete the family album. When it was his turn, Joe spoke of his notebook and the memories he'd planted there, and of the purple iris that reminded him hope could grow even in broken soil. Dr. Marcus nodded and offered gentle insight. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means weaving our loss into the tapestry of our lives so that it becomes part of what sustains us. Those words settled like sunlight through the stained glass, illuminating new possibilities. For the first time, Joe considered that his story might one day shift from vigil to legacy, something beyond waiting, something active and enduring. That evening, he wandered through the airport terminal with a new intention. Instead of scanning faces for signs of loss, he watched people seeking connection. A young couple sharing earbud headphones, an elderly man feeding coins into a payphone to call his granddaughter, a group of children chasing each other past the departure gates. He realized that life's momentum was not an obstacle to his grief, but a cradle in which hope could rock gently back and forth. He returned to room 314 and placed fresh pages in his notebook. By lamplight, he wrote a new entry, Memory 13. Pam turning somersaults across the living room floor, her laughter rising like wind chimes, while Katie and Shannon clapped in delight. We built forts that day from couch cushions and blankets, and never did the three of us feel more invincible. He paused, pen hovering above the paper, and felt an unfamiliar sensation, anticipation. He imagined sharing these stories not only with Sarah and Rosa, but with strangers who might find solace in his words. He considered publishing his notebook online or reading it aloud at the next community gathering. The notion made his pulse quicken with excitement and terror in equal measure. Over the following days, Joe began to sketch a plan. He printed copies of selected entries and distributed them at the community board, inviting others to leave notes or memories beside his pages. Responses trickled in. A neighbor recalled the kindness of strangers who brought hot coffee when the first frost arrived. A retired pilot wrote of the importance of flight crew's vigilance. Even a flight attendant's daughter shared her mother's final message, scrawled on a napkin mid-flight, promising to send postcards from Paris. Gradually, the bulletin board transformed into a living archive, a tapestry of grief and gratitude interwoven. Joe watched families pause before it, some wiping tears, others nodding in recognition. One afternoon, a teenage girl clutched the pages and turned to Joe with bright eyes. "Your story gave me courage to speak about my mom," she said. Joe felt a swell of emotion, pride, sorrow, and an ember of joy, and realized he was no longer alone in his vigil. His waiting had become an offering, and in giving it away, he discovered its purpose. On a rainy Saturday, he joined Sarah and Rosa for a small planting ceremony. They brought bulbs of autumn crocuses to add color to the memorial garden before winter's hush. As they dug each hole, they shared laughter and tears, stories of Michael's shy grin, of Katie's playful hugs, of Shannon's artistic triumphs. Together they whispered blessings into the soil, tucking memories alongside bulbs that would lie dormant until spring. When the rain tapered off, Joe stood back and surveyed their work. The soil, dark and rich, held promise beneath its surface. He knelt by the first crocus and pressed a small stone next to it, etched with the single word, remember. He closed his eyes and felt Pam's presence in the rhythmic patter of raindrops, in the scent of wet earth, in the quiet hum of life pressing on. That night, as he packed his bags to check out of the Ramada Plaza, Joe felt an unexpected pang. Room 314 had been his sanctuary, the cocoon in which he confronted despair and nurtured hope. Yet he knew it was time to return to Houston, to the empty house that held echoes of laughter and the promise of new memories. He took one last look at the room. The pressed rose, the notebook filled with stories, the faint imprint of his vigil on the wall. He closed the door gently, carrying its lessons in his heart. At JFK, he paused by the fence one final time. The iris and crocuses lay hidden beneath a grate for winter protection, but their promise was woven into the earth. He placed his hand on the cool metal and whispered, "Thank you for the strength to wait and for the courage to live." As he turned toward the terminal, he felt the weight of his grief shift from burden to treasure, proof that love, once planted, blooms forever. The Delta flight touched down in Houston under a pale winter sun, the city's sprawling silhouette emerging through a haze of early morning mist. Joe peered out the window, heart pounding with equal measures of anticipation and apprehension. He had spent months at JFK, mourning, remembering, planting seeds of hope, but this was the moment he had both dreaded and longed for, returning to the house that had once echoed with laughter. Dragging his suitcase across the smooth terminal floor felt oddly like stepping through a portal into a different life. The wheels clicked in time with his thoughts. This used to be our life. This used to be my refuge. He adjusted the baseball cap, pulled low over his eyes, and walked toward the baggage claim carousel. Each loop of the conveyor, emblematic of the circling grief he had finally begun to unravel. Outside, the cool breeze carried the scent of damp earth and distant magnolias. Joe hailed a cab and gave the address of his suburban home in Kingwood. The drive was familiar, tree-lined streets where leaves lay in mottled patches, houses with children's toys scattered across driveways, neighbors bundled against the morning chill. Yet everything felt surreal, as if seen through a veil of memory. When the cab stopped in front of his house, Joe hesitated on the sidewalk, suitcase at his side, bracing himself for the silence on the other side of the door. He unlocked the front door, stepping into a foyer that smelled faintly of lavender air freshener, the scent Pam had chosen. His chest tightened as he flicked on the lights. The living room lay exactly as he had left it. The pale green sofa where Pam had napped on Sundays, the coffee table scarred with water rings from stray mugs, and the fireplace mantel lined with framed family photos. But the frames were empty now, glass reflecting only his solitary figure. He walked the length of the room, fingertips grazing the frames, tracing the outlines of faces no longer there. In the kitchen, he paused before the apron hanging on the refrigerator, Pam's gift from the day they learned they'd be parents. He lifted it gently, inhaling its worn cotton texture. The aroma of toasted peanut butter and jelly, a childhood staple he once made for Shannon and Katie, drifted to mind. He straightened, took off his jacket, and draped the apron over his arm. It felt both comforting and unbearably sad, a relic of simpler joys. He carried his suitcase to the spare room that had been prepared for them on visits to New York. The walls, once painted a cheerful shade of lavender for Shannon and Katie, now felt hollow. He set the suitcase on the neatly made bed and opened it, revealing the notebook, the pressed rose, and the small stone engraved with "Remember." He laid each item on the bedside table as though arranging a shrine, an anchor to the months spent across the country. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the curtains as he sat down at the kitchen table, apron still resting on his arm. He rummaged in a drawer for the scrapbook Sarah had given him and opened it to the page with Michael's drawing, and the pressed rose petal. He ran his thumb over the faded pencil lines, a gentle reminder that shared grief could foster unbreakable bonds. He realized then that he was not alone, that across the miles, Sarah and Rosa and countless others had woven their stories into the tapestry he carried home. He spent the rest of the day unpacking, clothes, toiletries, keepsakes, giving each its place in the drawers and shelves. He found a spot for the notebook on a small desk in the corner of the living room, where natural light streamed in through the bay window. He cleared away old bills and random mail, making space for something new. As he worked, he felt the tight knot in his chest begin to loosen, each small act of organization a step toward reclaiming his life. Late that evening, after unpacking, he sat at the desk and flicked on a small reading lamp. The living room was quiet except for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the soft rustling of leaves outside. Joe opened a fresh page in his notebook and wrote, "January 10th, 1997, my first day back in our home. The walls are empty, but my heart is filling again with stories yet untold. This is where healing takes root." He paused, pen in hand, and looked around the room. He imagined Shannon's first steps down this hallway, Katie's giggles echoing off these walls. The memories felt bittersweet, but they also felt alive, with potential for new beginnings, for laughter that would one day return. That night he lay in the master bedroom, the emptiness beside him both painful and full of promise. He stared at the ceiling, thinking of Pam's gentle breathing, of afternoons reading aloud to their daughters. The silence was deep, but not oppressive. Instead, it offered space, a blank canvas on which to paint the next chapters of his life. Before drifting off, he whispered into the darkness, "I'm home now. I'll carry you with me, every day." He felt the weight of grief settle into a quiet hum, no longer a roar drowning out his future. As sleep claimed him, he dreamed of irises blooming in spring, crocuses pushing through thawing earth, and laughter returning to fill these empty walls. Late February in Houston whispered of change. A pale sun filtered through budding magnolia branches, promising warmth after months of winter's chill. Joe awoke early, drawn by the pale light dancing on the living room walls. He dressed quickly and stepped onto the porch, inhaling the clean air flecked with the scent of damp earth and new growth. The yard was still sparse, brown grass dotted with stubborn green shoots, but he knew that beneath the surface, life stirred in hidden rhythms. Inside, the kitchen table bore his open notebook, filled with memory entries and reflections. On its edge lay a sprig of quince flowers he'd rescued from the memorial garden at JFK before returning home. He lifted the stem, marveling at its delicate blooms, pale pink cups cradling golden stamens. He pressed it between the pages beside his January 10th entry, a tangible reminder that beauty could flourish even after sorrow's frost. Joe poured himself coffee and settled at the table, pen in hand. He wrote the date at the top of a fresh page, February 28th, 1997. He paused, considering what to document, how grief had shifted from a tidal wave to a steady pulse, how the ache in his chest now carried the sweetness of remembrance rather than raw despair. Then he wrote, "First signs of spring. The quince blooms you would have adored, the way Shannon's paintings would have brightened the kitchen wall. Katie's giggles echoing among these trees. I plant these memories like seeds, waiting for them to bloom anew." Finishing the entry, he closed the notebook and stood, compelled to nurture this new season of his life. He stepped into the yard with a small trowel and a packet of crocus bulbs saved from the JFK planting ceremony. He knelt in the soft earth and gently created holes in neat rows along the garden bed. Each bulb he placed in the soil was an act of hope, an affirmation that out of darkness could come color, fragrance, and life. He covered the bulbs with earth, patting down the soil and whispering blessings into the furrows. When the bulbs were planted, Joe stood back and surveyed his work. The bed looked bare now, but he knew the promise sleeping beneath the surface. He straightened and brushed the back of his hand across his brow, glancing toward the street where school buses would soon rumble by. In a few weeks, he imagined Shannon's laughter as she arrived home, clutching a report card, Katie's excited chatter about art projects. Those days felt close enough to taste, like the faint sweetness of spring nectar. Entering the house, Joe realized he needed to rejoin the world beyond his memories. He dressed in jeans and a light jacket, grabbed his keys, and headed to the public library downtown, a place he and Pam had frequented with their daughters. He parked in the shaded lot and walked past the rows of oak trees, whose branches arched overhead, their petal-dusted trunks bearing the marks of seasons past. Inside the library, the familiar hush greeted him, the soft thump of pages turning, the distant hum of the copier, the muted footsteps of visitors wandering between shelves. He paused at the entrance to the children's section, where low wooden tables held stacks of picture books and cozy beanbags beckoned young readers. A librarian looked up and smiled in recognition, a brief nod that warmed him more than any sunlight. Joe selected a well-loved copy of Where the Wild Things Are and carried it to a round table. As he settled in, a small cluster of toddlers and a parent gathered nearby for story time. The librarian began reading aloud, her voice gentle and animated. Joe watched the children's faces light up at each turn of the page, their eyes wide with wonder at the adventures of Max and his wild companions. He imagined Shannon turning the pages, Katie giggling at the mischief, Pam's soft voice drawing them in. For the first time in months, his heart stirred not with ache, but with gratitude, to have known such moments, to hold them still in memory. After the reading, the children scampered into the stacks, and Joe lingered over the shelf of local history. He pulled down a photograph collection documenting Houston's past, its small-town origins, its battle with floods, its resilience in the face of hurricanes. He turned the pages, noting the ways the city had weathered storms, rebuilt itself stronger each time. He reflected on his own storm, the explosion that fractured his world, and recognized a kindred spirit in the city's history. He checked out a small stack of books, children's picture books, a memoir of loss and healing, a gardening guide for spring blooms, and headed home. On the drive back, he replayed the morning's moments, the quince blooms, the crocus planting, the children's laughter. Each memory felt like a stepping stone, guiding him deeper into life rather than holding him captive in grief. Back in his kitchen, Joe brewed tea and spread the books across the dining table. He thumbed through the gardening guide, making notes on tulip varieties and soil amendments. He marked pages in the memoir, its author speaking of emerging from beneath grief's weight like a flower pushing through concrete. He set aside the children's books, a plan forming in his mind, a small reading corner in the living room where neighborhood kids could gather for story time, a way to honor Shannon and Katie's love of books. That evening, as dusk settled over the neighborhood and streetlights flickered on, Joe sat in his newly planted garden bed and watched the sky blush in shades of rose and lavender. He felt a gentle breeze carry the faint scent of quince, the promise of blooms in the air. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, allowing himself to feel the interwoven threads of past and future. His journey through grief had taught him that love never dies. It transforms like the seasons into something both familiar and new. He rose, brushed his hands on his jeans, and walked toward the back door. Inside the entryway, his boots left faint prints on the tile, traces of a man who had ventured through loss and emerged ready to plant new roots. He looked at the rows of empty picture frames lining the staircase walls and smiled. One by one, he would fill them, not with absence, but with the vibrant testimonies of life lived and love remembered. Spring sunshine filtered through the lace curtains as Joe stood at the foot of his staircase, surveying the empty picture frames that lined the walls, a gallery waiting for new stories. He carried 2 canvas tote bags, one heavy with children's books rescued from the local library sale, the other filled with hand-painted bookmarks and a small bell for story time. Today was the day he would launch his first Reading with Joe gathering, honoring Shannon and Katie's love of books and laughter. Downstairs, the living room had been rearranged into a cozy nook. A soft rug lay before a low bookshelf stocked with picture books and memoirs of hope. 2 armchairs flanked a small coffee table, atop which rested a teapot and mugs with floral patterns. String lights twined along the mantelpiece, where a single iris bulb peeked from a small pot, proof that life could emerge even from darkness. Joe adjusted a plush beanbag near the rug, pausing to remember how Katie used to tug at cushions to make forts, and how Shannon arranged her drawings into makeshift galleries. He inhaled deeply, imagining their giggles echoing here once more. At mid-morning, the doorbell chimed. First, a shy little girl with pigtails clutching her grandmother's hand, then 2 boys in baseball caps carrying toy airplanes, then a mother wheeling an infant in a stroller. By 11 o'clock, chairs formed a semicircle around the reading rug, and Joe welcomed everyone with a warm smile and a gentle nod. He rang the small bell, a clear, hopeful tone that seemed to settle restlessness into eager anticipation. Today, he began, voice steady, we're going to travel to wild places, meet brave heroes, and discover magic hidden in ordinary moments. He held up Where the Wild Things Are, its cover worn but vibrant, and the children leaned in, eyes wide. As he read, his voice rose and fell with the story. Max's mischief, the thunderous arrival of the wild things, the bittersweet longing for home. The children gasped at Max's roar, clapped when the wild things danced, and fell silent when Max chose his supper and his mother over remaining king. At the end, Joe closed the book and looked into their faces, children who saw adventure in their own backyards, who knew without knowing the ache of loss, but understood the comfort of coming together. After a round of thank yous, the children selected bookmarks, some adorned with pressed quince petals, others painted with crocus blossoms. Joe handed each one a bookmark and invited them to write or draw their favorite moment from the story. Laughter and crayons filled the room as simple artwork sprouted across white paper, roaring monsters, imagined forts, and tiny hearts. A shy boy in a red cap handed Joe his drawing, an iris under a bright sun. Joe tucked it into his journal, a keepsake of this new tradition. Once the children had gone home, still clutching their books and bookmarks, Joe sat at the window with a cup of tea and watched the garden outside. The iris pot caught his eye. One purple bloom stood firm, petals unfurled. He thought of Pam's joy at spring's first flowers, of laughter trickling through these rooms, of the stories that had filled their home. He realized that by inviting others in, he had sown seeds of connection that would blossom long after he was gone. That afternoon, he drafted flyers for weekly readings and pinned them at the library, the community center, and in the Ramada Plaza's lobby, where some grief had begun, but where hope had taken root. He wrote, Reading with Joe, Stories, Smiles and Community, Saturdays at 11 a.m., all ages welcome. His handwriting wavered only slightly as he signed his name, Joseph Lychner, father, storyteller, gardener of souls. As evening settled, he retrieved his notebook and wrote a new entry, March 15th, 1997. Today, childhood wonder returned to these walls. In the laughter of strangers' children, I heard echoes of my own, and my heart swelled with gratitude. May these stories light the way for all who enter. He closed the notebook and looked up at the mantelpiece, where the iris bulb thrived under the glow of the string lights. He understood now that tradition was not confined to birth or blood, but could be woven from community, from shared moments of joy and comfort. The vigil at JFK had taught him faith. His return home had taught him renewal. And this, he realized, was the culmination of both, a living tribute carried forward in every story read, every seed planted, every memory shared. As Joe turned out the lights and prepared for bed, he whispered into the quiet rooms, Thank you for guiding me here. Tomorrow, we write the next chapter together. And with that promise, he drifted into sleep, the soft hum of hope cradling him through the night. The following Saturday dawned bright and clear, as if the sky itself had decided to lend its blessing to Joe's fledgling tradition. He arrived at the living room early, arranging chairs, fluffing cushions, and topping off the teapot with hot water. The hush before the children arrived carried its own anticipation, an echo of so many mornings at JFK when he'd stood alone, waiting for word that never came. But today, that waiting felt different. It felt expectant, alive, charged with possibility. At precisely 11 o'clock, the doorbell rang and a steady stream of families entered. Some faces were familiar. Mrs. Delgado and her twins, who delighted in dragon stories. The Patel sisters, whose quiet curiosity transformed each page into an adventure. Even Mr. Robinson, the retired schoolteacher who came to share memories of reading to his grandchildren. New faces appeared too, a foster child with wary eyes, a mother returning after weeks of struggling with her own grief, neighbors drawn by the promise of community and kindness. Joe greeted each one by name, feeling the gentle warmth of connection knit the group into a tapestry of shared humanity. Today's story was Owl Moon, a quiet tale of a father and daughter braving the cold night to glimpse the elusive great horned owl. Joe read with measured pauses, inviting the children to imagine the hush of snow underfoot, the soft calls in the dark, the thrill of discovery. When he finished, he asked them to close their eyes and remember a time they felt wonder. A small voice whispered of finding her first seashell. Another spoke of watching fireflies light up a summer dusk. In each recollection, Joe heard the same magic that once filled his own family's moments. He encouraged them to draw those memories, and as crayons flew across paper, the room hummed with creativity and shared joy. After the children left, slipping into the bright spring afternoon, Joe lingered at the table, gathering the drawings. Each one was a gift. A dragon coiled around a castle, a moonlit forest where great eyes stared down, a pair of hands cradling a bird's feather. He pressed them into his journal beside the entries for March 15th and February 28th, creating a mosaic of memories, some borrowed, some new, all infused with life. He realized that his grief, once a storm that threatened to consume him, had become the current that carried these ripples outward, touching far more hearts than his own. That evening, he received a call from Sarah Chang, whose voice held excitement he hadn't heard in months. She described how her granddaughter had begun writing her own stories, inspired by the scrapbooks and readings they'd shared. Rosa's letter arrived too, thanking him for the crocus bulbs that sprouted in her garden under the Korean sky. She sent photographs of purple blooms against ancient stone walls, a testament to friendship transcending distance. Joe felt a surge of gratitude. His story had reached beyond fences and borders, weaving a network of hope with threads spun from loss and love. In the days that followed, neighborhood children gathered behind Joe's house, hunting for the first crocus shoots peeking through thawing soil. He guided them gently, showing how to coax the green tips toward the sun, how to nurture them to bloom. Parents watched, cameras poised, as the flowers unfurled their violet petals in celebration of life's return. Joe remembered the iris at JFK, the crocuses planted before he left, and marveled at how a single dream, watered with patience and care, could flower in ways he never imagined. That spring, he also volunteered at the airport's remembrance services, sharing his story with newly bereaved families. He spoke not of pain alone, but of the journey beyond, the vigil, the chapel's solace, the planting of memories, the birth of traditions. His words resonated with those who arrived in the Ramada lobby, eyes hollow with fresh grief, and in the spaces between his sentences, he offered them the gift of hope. Time and again, strangers approached him afterward to say, "Your waiting inspired me to find my own path forward." In their gratitude, he found a deeper purpose, a legacy born from sorrow but rooted in love. Late one evening, as the sky shifted from amber to indigo, Joe walked through his garden by the glow of lanterns strung along the fence. The crocuses and iris nodded gently in the breeze, whispers of spring echoing through the petals. He paused beneath the bare limbs of the quince tree, now studded with tiny buds, and placed a hand on its rough bark. He spoke softly, as if to an old friend. "Thank you for teaching me that endings can become beginnings." The words felt true in his bones, resonating with every seed he had planted. Memory seeds, hope seeds, kindness seeds, each destined to ripple outward. He returned inside, notebook in hand, and wrote, April 12th, 1997. The ripples of our stories spread farther than I ever dreamed. From Seattle to Seoul, from this living room to distant skies, memory is our shared celebration of life. We are gardeners of the heart, sowing love where loss once took root. He closed the journal and looked around the quiet room, the soft hum of the air conditioner a lullaby after a day of vibrant life. Tomorrow would bring new stories, new seeds to plant, and the promise of growth in every corner. He switched off the light, confident that even in darkness, his memories and the love they carried would shine brighter than ever. Summer arrived in Houston like a triumphant fanfare, the heat rolling in on gusts of humid air that smelled faintly of magnolia and freshly cut grass. Joe stepped onto his porch each morning, inhaling the rich fragrance as he sipped his coffee, appreciating how different this dawn felt from the endless vigil he once kept at JFK. Here, surrounded by the life he had nurtured back to bloom, he sensed the culmination of his journey, a transformation from bereft father into guardian of memory and hope. His mornings began with ritual, a walk through the garden, where irises and crocuses bloomed side by side, their petals unfurled in vivid defiance of the long winter that had seemingly never ended. The quince tree had burst into blossoms weeks ago, pale pink storms against the summer sky, and now the branches hung heavy with the promise of small, tart fruit to come. Joe paused at each flower bed, hands brushing gently over leaves as though greeting old friends, whispering gratitude for their persistence. After his walk, he entered the living room to find the reading nook already prepared for the day's visitors. Colorful storybooks lined the low shelves, while drawings and paintings from past gatherings were pinned above. Little masterpieces depicting dragons, owls, and gardens of every conceivable hue. The beanbag, once a prop for Katie's forts, now bore a children's cushion embroidered with the words, "Home is where the heart grows." Joe straightened the pillows on the armchairs and set out a fresh pot of tea, its steam curling into the air like lazy tendrils of memory. But today was not a reading day. Today, a special event awaited. The launch of Wings of Renewal, a small exhibit at the Houston Airport's commemorative gallery, showcasing stories, artwork, and photographs submitted by families touched by the TWA Flight 800 tragedy. Months ago, when the gallery's curator reached out to Joe, having heard of his work, he hesitated, worried that exposing his grief on such a public stage might reopen old wounds. Yet Dr. Marcus's words echoed in his mind. Healing lies in weaving our loss into the fabric of life. And so he agreed, seeing the exhibit as an extension of the garden he had cultivated, a place where remembrance bore the fruit of collective resilience. He dressed in a crisp shirt and worn denim, tucking his notebook and a small bouquet of irises into his satchel. As he drove toward the airport, he reflected on how far he had come, from pacing the perimeter fence in relentless sorrow to planting crocuses in foreign soil to founding a children's reading circle that brought laughter back into his home. Each step had been an exercise in faith and courage, every new tradition a bid against despair. At the gallery entrance, Joe recognized faces both familiar and new. There was Sarah Chang, eyes bright as she adjusted a display case filled with Michael's drawings. Rosa Alvarez, standing beside photographs of purple bulb blooms against distant landscapes, families he had mentored through their first unbearable days, now arriving with their own contributions, handwritten letters, watercolor landscapes, even a small quilt pieced together from airline uniforms. The air hummed with subdued excitement, punctuated by shy smiles and soft greetings. Joe joined the curator by a large panel bearing his own title card, Wings of Renewal, Stories of Loss, Love, and New Beginnings. Underneath, items were arranged thoughtfully, a pressed rose petal in a glass dome, the little stone engraved, Remember, photographs of Pam, Shannon, and Katie, the notebook in its second edition form, bound in lavender linen. Visitors paused before the display, reading each caption with reverent attention. Joe felt a stirring of pride and tenderness. Here, the fragments of his broken world were reassembled into a mosaic of shared humanity. When the curator opened the floor for remarks, Joe stepped forward, voice steady, though his heart trembled beneath the surface. He spoke of the vigil at JFK, of the solidarity found in a Ramada lobby, of the healing power in planting seeds, literal and metaphorical. He described how children's laughter had guided him home, how reading aloud became a ceremony of remembrance, how each community gathering planted another flag of hope against the darkness of loss. His words flowed with sincerity, inviting the audience to see their own stories reflected in the exhibit's items. After the speech, visitors approached with quiet gratitude. A mother wept softly as she touched the rose petal, telling Joe it reminded her of the flower her daughter had tucked into her hair before the flight. An elderly veteran paused by the notebook and shared memories of his own wartime losses, acknowledging how the small act of storytelling had carried him through. Each exchange deepened the truth Joe had come to embrace, that in sharing our wounds, we allow healing to spiral outward, touching lives in ways we cannot foresee. When the exhibit officially opened, Joe slipped away to the outdoor terrace overlooking the runway. He watched planes ascend into the sky, sleek metal birds tracing graceful arcs against the cobalt expanse. For a long moment, he simply watched, recalling the last flight he had watched until hope faded into ashes. But today, his gaze was different. He no longer sought signs of return. Instead, he recognized the beauty of departure and arrival, the cyclical promise every flight carries, the chance to leave behind sorrow and discover new horizons. He closed his eyes, letting the warm wind ripple across his face, carrying distant jet exhaust, laughter from a nearby cafe, a child's delighted shriek as a model airplane soared on a father's updraft. In that symphony of life in motion, he sensed Pam's presence, gentle, encouraging. The same spirit that had guided him to plant memories like seeds, nurture them into traditions, and share their blooms with the world. Before leaving, he took one last look at the gallery through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Families clustered around displays. Children pressed their faces against glass cases. Elders wiped tears as they read tribute cards. The exhibit shone like a beacon of collective hope, proof that even the darkest tragedy could give rise to community, creativity, and compassion. Driving home, Joe felt the weight of his satchel against his side and reached inside to stroke the embroidery of the beanbag cushion he carried for the next reading session. He thought of the empty picture frames on his staircase walls, ready to be filled with new faces and new stories. He thought of the book nook waiting for tomorrow's laughter. He thought of the garden at home, aglow with iris and quince and crocus under the summer sun. He parked and stepped onto his porch, closing the door gently behind him. The evening air was alive with cicadas' trills and the distant hum of traffic. He set his satchel on the bench and exhaled, releasing the last of the day's tension. In his hand, he held a single iris from the bouquet he had brought, its petals crisp, its color radiant. He pressed it against his heart and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me how to fly again." As darkness fell and lanterns came to life in the garden, Joe walked among his flowers, counting blooms and blessings alike. He felt the gentle lift of possibility in every petal, every breeze, every memory carried on the wings of renewal. In that quiet celebration of life's resilient spirit, he understood at last that hope is not merely waiting for the dawn. It is the dawn. Autumn wrapped Houston in a tapestry of gold and rust, the crisp air carrying the scent of fallen leaves and fading blooms. Joe rose before dawn on a Saturday, drawn by a promise whispered in the wind, that today would mark another turning point in his journey. In the garden, the iris and crocus had long since faded, but the quince tree stood heavy with ripening fruit, its branches bowing under the apple's weight. He harvested a basketful, careful not to bruise the delicate skins, and carried them inside like precious treasures. In the kitchen, he washed and quartered the quince, filling the room with a heady perfume of citrus and spice. He set a large pot on the stove, adding sugar and water, and watched as the fruit simmered into a rosy compote. Each gentle bubble felt like a heartbeat, steady, hopeful, alive. As the quince transformed, Joe thought of how his own grief had shifted over the months, from fiery agony to a gentle sweetness that lingered even after sorrow's heat had cooled. By mid-morning, friends and neighbors arrived bearing jars and spoons, drawn by the promise of fresh preserves and community warmth. Sarah Chang carried a basket of homemade scones, their buttery aroma mingling with the quince. Rose Alvarez brought delicate empanadas filled with sweet potato and cheese, a taste of her Venezuelan heritage. The Patel family arrived with creamy yogurts topped with honey and walnuts, and Mrs. Delgado set out bowls of spiced tea to chase away the autumn chill. They gathered around the long farmhouse table Joe had built last spring, a project born of solace and purpose. Its oak surface bore the patina of shared meals and conversations, each scratch and stain a testament to lives intertwined. Joe ladled the quince compote into shallow bowls, each spoonful bursting with tangy sweetness. As they tasted, eyes closed in appreciation, stories began to flow. Memories of harvest festivals past, of first school dances, of dinners with Pam, Shannon, and Katie that left the table strewn with laughter and crumbs. At one end of the table, Mr. Robinson, the retired teacher, lifted his bowl. "This tastes of resilience," he declared, voice warm, "of finding beauty after the fire." Across from him, a young mother dabbed tears from her cheeks, confessing that she had feared Thanksgiving this year, afraid the empty seat at the head of her table would be too much. But sharing this meal, she said, reminded her that absence could become invitation, that new traditions could rise from grief's ashes. Joe listened to each testament, feeling the warmth spread through him like sunlight. He realized that the harvest of quince was more than a recipe. It was a metaphor for his own journey, the transformation of loss into nourishment, the weaving of old memories into new celebrations. He raised his spoon in a toast. "To memory and renewal, may we always find sweetness in the seasons of our hearts." They ate and talked until the sun dipped low, painting the sky in apricot and mauve. Children played in the yard, chasing fallen leaves and weaving between the chairs, their laughter a triumphant symphony of life's persistence. As the grown-ups cleared dishes and rinsed bowls, Joe felt a quiet joy settle over him, one born not from forgetting, but from fully embracing the richness that arose when sorrow was given space to transform. As twilight fell, he walked with Sarah and Rosa back toward the memorial garden behind his fence. Lanterns glowed along the pathway, illuminating the small crocus shoots already peeking through the soil, ready for winter's rest. He knelt beside one emerging green tip and pressed a gentle blessing into the earth. "Thank you," he whispered, "for reminding me that every ending contains a seed of beginning." That night he returned to his desk and opened the notebook to a fresh page. He wrote beneath a steady hand, October 18th, 1997. "Tonight we harvested quince together and discovered how sorrow can sweeten into sustenance. Our shared stories have become a feast for the heart, proof that love transforms season after season." He closed the notebook and placed his hand atop the worn cover, fingers lingering over the embossed title. Outside, a breeze stirred the lantern flames, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Joe felt the fullness of his life coursing through him, grief honored, memories cherished, and new traditions blooming in every corner. The winter chill had receded, yielding once more to the gentle warmth of early spring. On the morning of his final chapter, Joe stepped into the garden and paused at the edge of the quince tree, the first blossoms already brimming with promise. He inhaled deeply, tasting the sweet scent of renewal, and allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. 12 months had passed since the day he first set foot on the cold tarmac at JFK, rose in hand, clinging to a hope that felt impossible. Now, here he stood in a garden that pulsed with life, laughter, and the memory of love lived fully. Inside the living room, sunlight poured through the lace curtains onto the reading nook. Story time had grown into a beloved ritual. Sometimes children clustered around Joe's feet, sometimes elderly neighbors drifted in to listen as he read from memoirs of resilience. Drawings and photographs lined the walls, each one a vivid snapshot of lives intertwined by grief and compassion. Today, however, was special. Joe had invited all the friends he'd made on this journey: Sarah, Rosa, the Patel family, Mr. Robinson, the Delgado twins, and many others, to celebrate the official opening of the Memory Garden Pavilion, a simple wooden structure he had built at the far edge of his property. Here, he planned to gather once a month for generations to come, to honor those lost on TWA Flight 800 and to celebrate each new bloom of hope. By mid-morning, guests began to arrive, their footsteps crunching on the pebble path that led through beds of crocuses, irises, and the newest additions, lavender sprigs and bee-friendly wildflowers. The pavilion stood gleaming in the sun, a timber-framed gazebo with benches carved from reclaimed oak and a copper bell hanging at its entrance. Along the beams, ribbons and keepsakes fluttered in the breeze. A child's drawing of a silver plane soaring above an iris field, a pressed wildflower from Rosa's garden in Seoul, a simple nameplate reading Pam, Shannon, Katie in copper letters. Joe welcomed everyone with a warm clasp of the hand and a steady gaze that spoke volumes of the journey they'd shared. He called them to gather beneath the pavilion's slatted roof, where a circle of chairs and benches awaited. As they settled, he rang the bell, a clear, resonant tone that seemed to awaken the garden itself. Birds flitted from branch to branch overhead, their songs weaving into the hushed anticipation. He stood before the crowd, notebook in hand, and paused to look at each face, each story that had intertwined with his own. "This pavilion," he began, voice rich with emotion, "is more than wood and nails. It is a testament to our shared journey through grief, our commitment to remembrance, and our belief in the power of community to heal and to flourish." He gestured to the surrounding blooms. Every flower here was planted with a prayer, every ribbon tied with a memory. Here we honor those we lost, but we also celebrate the life that continues to grow from love's enduring roots. Sarah stepped forward then, placing a gentle hand on Joe's shoulder. She spoke of how writing their stories had given them language for sorrow and strength for renewal. Rosa followed, recounting the blooms that had sprung up in distant gardens, bridging oceans and continents. One by one, others shared brief reflections. The Patel sisters recited a poem about butterflies. Mr. Robinson read a letter from a former student who had found solace in Joe's readings. The Delgado twins sang a short, sweet song they had composed in honor of those who never returned home. When the words receded into a hushed pause, Joe opened his notebook to a fresh page. He read aloud the final entry he had written, March 22nd, 1998. "Today, we unveil this pavilion, not as a closed chapter, but as an open door. Each ribbon, each flower, each memory lives here in balance with the laughter of children, the stories we share, and the promise of new beginnings. May this place stand as a shelter for sorrow, a cradle for hope, and a beacon for all who seek the strength to remember and to carry on." As he finished, he set the notebook upon a small lectern carved from a fallen oak limb. With a nod, he invited all present to tie their own ribbons to the pavilion's beams, one ribbon for each person they remembered, each story they held dear. A gentle murmur of activity followed. Satin and lace fluttered in the breeze, each ribbon a vibrant testament to love's resilience. When the last ribbon was tied, Joe invited everyone to share refreshments beneath the quince blossoms. Tables groaned under the weight of quince tarts, lavender lemonade, crocus-infused honey, and freshly baked scones. Laughter and conversation wove through the air like honeybees darting between flowers. Children chased sunbeams through the pavilion's openings, their giggles echoing through the heart of the memory garden. As dusk approached, lanterns came to life along the garden paths, casting a golden glow over the celebration. Joe walked among his friends, offering thanks and receiving hugs. In each embrace, he felt the full measure of his journey, the pain of loss, the echo of vigil, the warmth of shared stories, and the profound joy of new traditions. That night, under a sky freckled with stars, Joe stood at the pavilion's threshold with Sarah and Rosa by his side. He placed his hand on the copper bell and rang it once more, a final note of promise that would carry on long after they departed. "This is not goodbye," he whispered. "It is the legacy we build together." In the gentle hush that followed, as lantern light danced on petals and ribbons swayed in a soft breeze, Joe knew that his family's story, Pam's laughter, Shannon's art, Katie's joy, had found its home in countless hearts. Their love had become the seed from which countless acts of kindness and remembrance had grown. And in that truth, he found peace, a legacy in full bloom, rooted in sorrow, but flowering forever in hope.